Thank you.
I see on the screen that Maria is a convidado, which sounds much better than guest.
Oh, right.
It
Yes,
sounds
yes, it's
more
like,
convivial.
yeah, it's in Portuguese.
Yeah. And Severio is an hospite.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. I'm glad to be an hospital.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to give it a couple of minutes and then we can get rolling. Okay, I think we might get started. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Douglas Kerr. Good morning, Vancouver. Good day to everybody else. Hope you had a restful night and are looking forward to today's session. We have 3 panels and the second keynote speech to look forward to today. Before we start, I've got some good news. Niels Clausen, whom we heard yesterday, has very kindly arranged for his publisher to send 2 copies of his new collection of essays titled Re-Examining Arthur Conan Doyle to give away at our conference. So the names of 2 lucky participants will be drawn from a digital hat and we'll get the books in the post to the winners. A couple of announcements or re-announcements really. First of all, for speakers other than the keynotes, please stick to the allotted 20 minutes, maximum 20 minutes. Chairs of sessions have been asked to intervene if you go over time. If you're sharing your screen, please choose the content only option. I'll repeat that because I don't know what it means. If you're sharing your screen, please choose the content only option. Okay, for listeners, you will be muted while the speaker is presenting. We find it's helpful if you can keep your microphone and your camera switched off while somebody else is speaking. That prevents interference. If you want to ask a question or to make a point, there will be an opportunity at the end of each session. And during the Q&A, please use the raise hand function or post your question in the chat. Okay, that's it from me. I think we can get started, though a few minutes early. So I'm going to hand over now to Robert Hampson, who's chairing the first panel, panel 4 on empire. Robert.
Thank you very much, Douglas. We have 3 speakers in this first panel, and the first speaker is Mark Jones. Dr. Jones studied and taught history at the University of York before embarking on a career in digital learning and faculty development. In 2002, he joined the BBC and the University of Hull to work on the development of the corporation's digital curriculum. I won't run through his whole career. He's worked on digital inclusion in the public and private sector, and since 2018 has worked as an independent consultant. He and his wife run the Arthur Conan Doyle podcast, Doings of Doyle, and this afternoon he's talking about Parables of Empire, Conan Doyle's Imperial Crisis in Tales of Long Ago. Mark, over to you.
Thanks very much, Robert. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that, Robert.
Yes,
Yeah.
I can see. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, in 1922, Conan Doyle wrote that if all my works were to be destroyed, save only that one single selection which I might elect to preserve, my choice would certainly be those short historical pictures which come under the heading of Tales of Long Ago. Now, why Conan Doyle should regard these stories so highly has been often overlooked, and the stories themselves have received scant attention. But in this talk, I'd like to argue that the Tales of Long Ago represent an important turning point in Conan Doyle's life, that they reflect his concerns for the erosion of civic virtues and his growing disenchantment with imperialism, and that they mark an important corresponding step in his adoption of spiritualism. The stories are a little obscure and appeared across several publications over a number of years, and then ultimately in different collections, so a bit of context is in order. The Tales of Long Ago consist of 12 short stories, of which one was written in 1908, 10 between 1909 and 1911, and one in 1922. That middle chunk of 10 stories were originally collected in the first half of the Lascali Impressions and Tales in 1911, the second half of that volume being a more eclectic mix of stories from the period, including such characters as Brigadier Gerard and Conan Doyle's pirate captain, Sharkey. Now, in the preface to this early collection of his Tales of Long Ago, Conan Doyle said that his intention in writing the stories was to bring history to life. He said, "There is a region between actual story and actual history which has never been adequately exploited. Facts might be coloured with the glamour which the writer of fiction can give, and fictitious characters and conversations might illustrate them. But nonetheless, the actual drama of history, and not the drama of invention, should claim the attention of the reader." Now, in this, as in so many other things, Conan Doyle was following in the footsteps of his beloved Walter Scott, whose Tales of a Grandfather had dramatised key moments in history, albeit rather more in the line of popular history than narrative fiction, and Conan Doyle was awarded a collection of these tales as a school prize at prep school. But Andrew Lycett suggests a more contemporary influence was Kipling's Puck of Pook's Hill, which was first published in 1906. And in this volume, a creature claiming to be Puck from A Midsummer Night's Dream tells two children a series of allegorical tales about British history and national identity with a distinctly Whiggish spin. Like Kipling, Conan Doyle saw in the past important lessons for the present, and he chose the Tales of Long Ago as a vehicle to expand on those lessons for his audience. This was not an impartial reportage of historical events, as he claimed in the preface. He had some intent behind the stories. In selecting the moments of history to cover, Conan Doyle chose to focus on what he referred to as various crises in the story of the human race. But in fact, what they have in common, for the most part, is the fate of empires. And in drawing parallels with the present day, Conan Doyle was expressing his concern that the fate of the British Empire hung in the balance. This, of course, was not an unusual position to hold in 1911, given rising European tensions and fears of war. But what is interesting is that in these stories, Conan Doyle focuses less on the external threats to empire than on the internal threats, and thus arguably on those things that can be controlled, as opposed to those that can't. A case in point is The Last of the Legions, which tells the story of the Roman withdrawal from Britain at the start of the 5th century AD. With the barbarians closing in on Rome, the Britons, led by the unsubtly named Celticus, are delighted to learn that the legions and their viceroy will soon be returning to Italy, the use of the anachronistic term underscoring that these are stories written for the present day. But when it becomes clear that the withdrawal is to be immediate and the Britons will be left defenseless, their joy quickly turns to fear. The legions depart, and in the story's coda, we learn that the British leaders were enslaved, tortured, and killed, and that the country was overrun within a year. Now, at one level, the story is a warning to the growing forces for independence in the British Empire to be careful what they wish for. The Romans are, after all, shown to be benevolent conquerors, tolerant of native demands, but it's very clear who's in charge. When Celticus demands greater independence for the Britons, the Roman viceroy tells him, "Had you spoken thus to some of my heathen ancestors, there would have been an end to your politics. That you have dared to stand before my face and say as much is a proof forever of the gentleness of our rule." So the Last of the Legions is not an attack on imperialism directly. Instead, it's an attack on a specific imperial policy. In May 1910, Conan Doyle told Greenhouse Smith, the editor of the Strand magazine, that the story concerned, quote, "the abandonment of India question," by which he meant the decision by the British government to withdraw from parts of the country, leaving the populace to what Conan Doyle saw as the mercy of local princes. Conan Doyle felt the government was betraying its imperial duty to extend civilization and maintain order, particularly over the dark forces of the Orient. As an aside, there's a little parallel in Conan Doyle's use of language on this point. In The Last of the Legions, when Pontus is musing on the inevitable Saxon invasion that will follow Rome's abandonment of Britain, he notes that where we saved, they will slay, they will burn. Where we planted, they will ravage. And almost 20 years later, in Our African Winter, Conan Doyle talks of the beneficence of the Raj in similar terms. Nature sends the smallpox, the Raj sends vaccine. Nature sends the flood, the Raj builds the dam. Nature sends the famine, the Raj supplies the food. For Conan Doyle, the duties and responsibilities of imperial rule and the values that underpin the way empire should be conducted in his eyes were critical, as is reflected in another story, The First Cargo. A sequel of sorts to The Last of the Legions, the story picks up the fate of Britain with the arrival of the Saxons, as reported by an unnamed Roman observer. The Britons, having, quote, "given up soldiering during the centuries the Romans guarded them, are now at the mercy of the Picts and Scots and have to call in Saxon mercenaries." The Saxons claim to have the interests of the islanders at heart with no prospect of advantage to themselves, but they quickly suggest that they would serve the Britons best by settling on their soil. The Roman observer, who has the measure of the predatory Saxons, tells one of them, "You will own this island before you've finished." The Saxon thinks perhaps so, and then quickly corrects himself and says theirs is, quote, "a temporary occupation, nothing more." One can reasonably ask how this is in any way different from the British occupation of India. But what differentiates the Saxons from the British in Conan Doyle's view of the world is the motivation behind their respective occupations. In The First Cargo, there is a disagreement between the Saxons that underscores this point. Kenna and Hasta are anxious to extend the Saxon power and to make it greater in the eyes of the world, while Lank thinks that they should give less thought to conquest and more to the comfort and advancement of their followers. Needless to say, Lank loses out. Observing the contrast between the excited Britons welcoming the intense Saxons, the Roman observer notes dryly, "It seemed to be more than ever dangerous to call in such allies." Now, one might expect Conan Doyle at this point to make warm statements about the fusing of these two cultures to create his beloved Anglo-Saxon. The story is, after all, prefaced with the Latin phrase ex ovo omnia, or all life comes from an egg, and there is indeed a brief nod in that direction. The Roman observer describes the Saxons as brave, hardy, and very pertinacious, while the Britons, who lack the Saxon steadiness of purpose, have quicker imaginations as compensation. But this isn't Pook's Hill, in which successive invasions of the British Isles result in a mongrel nation, the best of the best, with the positive features of the invading other absorbed into a dominant Britishness. There's no doubt in The First Cargo that the Saxons will subjugate the Britons, and the tone of the story's conclusion is positively funereal. So the values ascribed to the Saxons are diametrically opposed to those which Conan Doyle believed should underpin good imperial government. Seeking profit and power, the Saxons lie and deceive to achieve their ignoble ends. And in this description of the Saxons, Conan Doyle may well have been thinking of the example of the Belgian Congo, which earned his ire and disgust. His searing attack on King Leopold, The Crime of the Congo, was published in October 1909, a year before The First Cargo appeared in Scribner's magazine. Like The Crime of the Congo, The First Cargo is not an attack on empire, but on imperial misrule, and a particularly predatory form of economic imperialism. Conan Doyle was not opposed to the economic benefits of empire, and as a prospective parliamentary candidate around this time, he favoured protective imperial tariffs, but he saw these as tactical device for keeping Greater Britain together in the face of weakening imperial ties. In 1910, Conan Doyle was relieved not to win his seat and turned his back on the factional party politics he found increasingly distasteful. This distaste of politics and cynicism towards the political elite comes to the fore in another tale, The Last Galley. Described by Conan Doyle as the British naval question in Parable, it tells the story of the last Carthaginian galley limping home at the end of the Third Punic War. On the deck, the captain and a politician lament the hubris of the present, quote, vain and feeble generation, which has brought destruction on their people. Some thought of trade and some of votes and some of profits from the state, but none would see that the state itself, the mother of all things, was sinking to her end. So might the bees debate who should have wax or honey when the torch was blazing, which would bring to ashes the hive and all within. After the galley is sunk within sight of the shore, the Romans burn Carthage and plough the land with salt so that its people can never return. The survivors are left naked and starving, overlooking the destruction from the hilltops. And they understood too late that it is the law of heaven that the world is given to the hardy and to the self-denying, whilst he who would escape the duties of manhood will soon be stripped of the pride, the wealth, and the power, which are the prizes which manhood brings. Empire should be hardy and self-denying, a civilizing work for the greater good, but British politicians were thinking only of national gain. And more topically for the period, Britain was resting on her laurels, overconfident in her naval supremacy, as once Carthage had been. Conan Doyle does throw in what might initially appear to be a note of reassurance or perhaps consolation for his readers. The Carthaginian captain, noting that one day Rome too will fall, takes solace in a prophecy that the trident of the Queen of the Waters will be taken up by the people of the Tin Islands to the west, where painted savages can scarce row a wicker coracle from point to point, the reference to the Cassiterides, which were thought to be a separate island but now understood to be Cornwall. But this is not the same reassuring prophecy that Sir Nigel receives from Lady Tafane towards the end of the White Company, when she foresees countries as yet undiscovered uniting under the English flag and language. In referencing the rise of British naval power, Conan Doyle is actually signalling that empires come and go, and it will be no different for Britain. Lest one think Conan Doyle was being even remotely subtle, note that the story begins with another Latin phrase which translates as "change the name Britannia and the story is about you." While political factionalism comes in for criticism in the tales of long ago, so too does religious factionalism, most notably in The Coming of the Huns, Conan Doyle's most explicit description of imperial decline. The story is set in the 4th century AD and begins with some words on the fall of polytheism and the rise of a factional Christianity. Conan Doyle notes that in absorbing the vices, in abandoning the vices of polytheism, society had also abandoned its virtues, quote, among which toleration and religious good humour had been conspicuous. The scene then shifts to a Trinitarian hermit, Simon Milas, who leaves Rome for the Gothic settlements to escape the endless religious bickering. There, on a rocky outcrop on the easternmost extent of the empire, he meets another hermit, the distinctly anti-Trinitarian Paul of Nicopolis. They bicker and in comic fashion repair to their respective caves, never to speak again. Years later, Simon watches horrified as the barbarian army of the Mongols comes over the horizon from the east. He seeks out Paul of Nicopolis only to find him dead in his cave, his skull smashed open with his own crucifix. Simon himself narrowly escapes being murdered and bludgeons to death a Mongol with a stone, and so, in one of Conan Doyle's gloriously concise phrases, one roof covered the first slain of Europe and of Asia. The hermit makes his way to civilization to warn a Roman soldier, but already the great dark shadow is drawing near. In a few thousand words, Conan Doyle brilliantly summarizes the central thesis of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon argued that Rome's demise was the consequence of a decay from within, the progressive erosion of civic virtue, and the rise of religious intolerance, which ultimately made it susceptible to the barbarian attacks it had successfully fended off for centuries. Conan Doyle was hugely influenced by Gibbon. In his article Before My Bookcase in 1894, which was later reworked into his love letter to writing Through the Magic Door in 1907, Conan Doyle stated, "If I were to spend the remainder of my life upon an island and were condemned to choose only one book as my companion, it would certainly be Gibbon." And in fact, in all of the tales of long ago, one can read the intellectual debt owed to Gibbon, and particularly his view of the dangers of waning civic virtue. Beyond the criticisms of politicking, greed, and religious intolerance, the stories also include slights at militarism for its own sake in Giant Maximin, based on the life of Maximinus Thrax, at absenteeism again in The Last of the Legions, and even self-delusion and sycophancy in the comic short story The Contest. This concern eked out into other writings. Beyond the tales of long ago, but written around the same time, The Pot of Caviar takes aim at defeatism. Set during the Boxer Rebellion, the story tells of a party of Europeans who are poisoned by one of their number to save them falling into the hands of the invisible demonic Chinese. In another contemporaneous tale, The Bruce Partington Plans, the villain is again an internal threat to empire, a traitor, the epitome of one who undermines civic virtue, as opposed to the external threats of foreign agents who are largely impotent in the case. Conan Doyle believed passionately in this civilizing mission, but there's a sense in these stories that he increasingly felt imperialism was not the tool to achieve that end. And this can be seen in his public life and other writings as well. In 1911, when The Last Galley, Impressions and Tales first appeared, he declared himself in favour of Irish Home Rule. And the following year, The Lost World offered a conflicted view of colonialism, which at once lauds the pioneering spirit, but leaves Maple Whiteland the prey of hunter and prospector, the next victim in line. There's a grim inevitability to the consequences of the British contact with the Lost World, and even well-meaning types such as our band of heroes devolve to all too human acts of brutality and bloodlust. In all these tales, Conan Doyle may have been signalling a feeling that the civilizing mission could no longer be trusted to empire because he had found an alternative in spiritualism. While the road to conversion was long and winding, the tales of long ago are an important and often overlooked step on that journey. On the superficial level, two of the stories deal directly with spiritualism, in that both The Silver Mirror and Through the Veil use mediumship as the framing device for their historical narratives. The main characters are credible, ordinary people who are receptive to exploring the unknown, a mindset Conan Doyle was seeking to cultivate in others, and they are rewarded with non-threatening journeys into the past that open up for them, quote, new and wider horizons. But on a deeper level, the anxiety within the tales of long ago shows Conan Doyle letting go of the imperial promise. As Brantlinger argued in Rule of Darkness, the ultimate victory of spiritualism was prefigured for Doyle in the demise of the empires of this world. The record of their demise can be found in Tales of Long Ago, and it is perhaps for this reason that Conan Doyle regarded them so highly. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much, and thank you for your good timekeeping. That was excellent. The second paper this morning is from Maria Brito. Maria is a PhD student in modern literatures and culture at Nova University of Lisbon. Her thesis explores the correlation between Arthur Conan Doyle's bibliography and Lisbon. Her research focuses on Anglo-Portuguese relations within the framework of Victorian studies, and she has a passionate interest in detective fiction. This morning she's going to talk about, or this afternoon rather, she's going to talk about The Fog from the East, Representations of the Orient in the Sherlockian canon. So Maria, over to you.
Hello, good afternoon, thank you. I hope you can see me. Okay. Let me see here. I can share. Okay, sorry. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Can see the
Can you see-
PowerPoint now,
Yes,
yes.
we can see
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
sorry. Sorry. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Birkbeck University of London and the Edinburgh Conan Doyle Conference organization. And also I would like to thank the attendees. The purpose of this paper is to point out the major representations of the era of the Orient in the Sherlockian canon, focusing on Edward Said mythology in Orientalism, the binomial distinction between the East, the other, versus the West, the self, is significant to underscore as a consequence of British imperialism. Said points out nearly every 19th century writer was extraordinarily aware of the fact of the empire. From this point, I propose to analyze the historical context, the late Victorian era, its dualities and anxieties. In this context, the main objective will be centered in the city of London as a representation of the center of the British Empire and the East-West dichotomy. The main purpose will be to mark some of the Oriental characters present in the Sherlockian canon, the Holmes and Watson dichotomy, addressing the vectors of post-colonial studies theories, such as reverse colonialism and the ambivalence of mimicry, in a correlation between the colonized and the colonizer. During the reign of Queen Victoria, the British rule spread across several continents due to British expansion. The West, which had already reached industrialization, believed that it was necessary to extend this process to new communities considered uncivilized and savage. From Canada, passing through West Africa and even Australia, the British possessions covered a very wide territory. However, the jewel of the British crown was, without doubt, India. In 1875, Great Britain acquired the Egyptian share in Suez Canal, guaranteeing its route to India. In 1876, it was given to Queen Victoria the title of Empress of India. During the expansion of the British Empire, there were several revolts result from invasions and battles, as the Crimean War, the Indian Rebellion, Anglo-Egyptian War. It must be underlined the South African Wars, where Sir Arthur Conan Doyle served as a volunteer doctor. One of the great dichotomies of the Victorian era was the correlation between tradition and innovation. The innovation resulting from a scientific development and the tradition resulting from an austere religious thought. The publication in 1859 of Charles Darwin's seminal work on the origins of species by means of natural selection shook an entire society that dipped between these two antagonist vectors. From this moment on, the unique character of the human being became questionable and the mathematics of the double emerged. Works like Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, published in 1886, and The Adventure of the Creeping Man by Arthur Conan Doyle, published in 1923, are still representative of this anxiety regarding alterity and the subject of human regression. It is in this ambience and in this context that the Sherlockian canon emerges, reflecting some of the Victorian concerns and fears. The image of the Orient is very present in many tales of the so-called Sherlockian canon. The image of the other always reflects the image of the self, the image of the one who sees thus transmitting his identity, his values, and his culture. In this way, we can analyze the image that the Orient represented not only for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, but for Victorian England, the period in which the author belonged to. The binomial East and West, although antagonistic, are correlated. They are inseparable notions. There cannot be a division between them, since it is through the confrontation with the other that the self defines itself. They are thus two different parts of a global whole. The city of London is also an example of this dichotomy between East and West. The West filled with opulence and the East home of the poorest population. London, the capital of the British Empire, representative of the imperial development and its richness, it is the core of a melting pot of different migrant communities in poverty. In the tale The Man with Twisted Lip, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle illustrates this degeneration of London through the descriptions of an opium house. The consumption of opium from the Orient was a current practice in the Victorian era. Until July 1868, when the Pharmacy Act was established, these products were sold freely and without any control or restriction. This spreading of opium through the city streets and the nation, the gaining ground from an oriental drug, transforms the colonized into a colonizer and the colonizer into the colonized. This reverse colonialism subjugates the West and makes it dependent. The use of opium is transversal to all social classes, as is also exemplified in this short story. In this style, the character Isa Whitney, a member of the upper middle class, is found in an opium house in East London. Isa, a man of noble character, is thus bent, dependent, dominated by the oriental drug, the wreck and ruin of a noble man. The description of the opium house that Isa attends takes us not only to the primitive genesis of the human being, but also to a place of darkness. Watson describes that he was on a downward path to a dark cave, like the mouth of a cave. This downward journey is only compared to Bosch Fowler painting Christ in Limbo, the descent into a limbo, in this case a limbo with Oriental origins, responsible for the regression of the human being made through the representation of animal figures with bodies distorting in the dark. In fact, it can be considered that this degeneration caused by the consuming of opium with its source from the East is spreading in the heart of the British Empire like a contagious disease. As a matter of fact, drugs from the East are referred in the canon as a ways of altering consciousness or even causing death. This reality about the use and effects of drugs, such as opium and cocaine, occurs throughout the Sherlock Holmes canon. Holmes' character rarely uses these substances, although he recognizes that it can affect him physically. He believes that it stimulates the mind. However, Watson criticizes its use, saying that not only do they cloud the mind, they kill it over time. Once more, the binomial between West and East is present. On the one hand, we have the brilliant mind of an Englishman, the supreme intelligence of the British Empire, West, and on the other, substances from the East whose effect is unhealthy and do provoke a terrible consequence. The warning made by Watson intends to reach Holmes, but also the reading public, warning of the threat such substances can cause. A contamination that comes from the East and intends to spread through the British Empire, dominating it, destroying its powers, and consequently eliminating it. This degeneration caused by drugs can also be related with poisons originated from the East. In the Sign of Four, Bartholomew Sholto is killed with a poison thorn, certainly not English, but prepared by a native of the Andaman Islands, Tonga. This poison had entered the system, provoking death and a state of extreme contraction, a severe muscular rigidity. In The Adventure of the Speckled Band, the use of a venomous serpent as a means to commit murder could only occur to a twisted man with Eastern grounding, as Dr. Grimsley Roylott, a British doctor who practiced in India. In fact, Holmes links this Indian background and fauna as merely the means of achieving a crime. In the short story, The Adventure of the Dying Detective, Dr. Watson is called by Mrs. Hudson to attend Holmes, who seems to be dying from a contagious disease. His sickness, an oriental fever, needs to be tended by an expertise of Eastern diseases. According to Said, the Orient is always described as wild, savage, and decadent, and I quote, "Europe was always in a position of strength, not to say domination. The Oriental is irrational, fallen, childlike, different. Thus, the European is rational, virtuous, mature, normal." End of quote. As a matter of fact, in the novel The Sign of Four, the character Tonga, an indigenous from the Andaman Island, is the parroting of the Oriental, primitive, childish and savage. And I quote, "This savage, distorted creature, that face was enough to give a man a sleepless night. Never have I seen features so deeply marked with all bestiality and cruelty. Of animal fury." End of quote. Tonga is also the example of the colonized devoted to the colonizer in this novel, represented by the character of the repatriate Jonathan Small. And I quote, "Tonga, for that was his name, was a fine boatman and owned a big roomy canoe of his own. When I found that he was devoted to me and would do anything to serve me." End of quote. Like the character Friday from the novel Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, Tonga's role is of subservience, obedience, and loyalty. Tonga is described as a cannibal and exhibited as a bizarre specimen at fairs, at freak shows, which were very popular at the time. The boat chase across the Thames, led by Holmes, and the consequent death of Tonga after a failed attempt to assassinate Holmes can be seen as an analogy to British colonialism and the supremacy of the colonizer over the colonized. After being killed, Tonga falls into the River Thames, extinguishing himself in its waters. Also, in the Sign of Four are referred characters from Indian origins, like the Sikhs, the first, Mohammed Singh and Abdullah Khanat, and the third, Dost Akbar. These three characters, greedy and malevolent, represent the negative side of the East, willing to kill for personal enrichment. And like the Eastern natives, they are doubtful and are described as wild Punjabis. The negative influence of the East transfigures human nature, and this is present throughout the Sherlockian canon. The East managed to transform respectable and dignified British people into shadows of themselves, whether on a physical level or on a physical level, or both. Whoever lives for the East no longer returns the same. Dr. Watson, for example, was stationed in India, but only brought him nothing but misfortune and disaster. He was struck on the shoulder by a Jezebel bullet and returns to England to recover from an enteric fever that curse over Indian possessions. And although he recovers, the physical wounds remain, thus he still has pain's consequence of his staying in the East. In the novel The Sign of Four, the obscure roots that come from the East can also be noted in the character Jonathan Small and his history, The Strange Story of Jonathan Small. After his stay in India, Small finds himself physically scarred with a wounded leg, and emotionally he is rude, greedy, heartless man. In The Adventure of the Speckled Band, the character, Dr. Roylott, a doctor returned from India, whose behavior was changed after his stay in the East. He is the anti-hero of the tale, a rude and aggressive character who threatens Holmes, hero and the symbol of the British Empire, at the beginning of the tale. Yet, in the end, the anti-hero is murdered by the most deadly snake of India. In The Crooked Man, the character Henry Wood recounts his entire experience in India as a soldier and how this changed him, even physically, because after his capture he was tortured and left deformed for the rest of his life. In this tale, Henry Wood, victim of an ambush in India caused by Major Barclay, returns to England after 30 years. Henry Wood's character is both villain and victim, as is Major Barclay's character, also a returnee, who ends up dying of apoplexy when confronted with a vision of his past. The degeneration through criminal widespread is present in the short story The Adventure of the Empty House. Sebastian Moran, the second most dangerous man in London, a British Army veteran after his stay in India, he retired, came to London, and again acquired an evil name. And he is recruited by Professor Moriarty, Holmes' archenemy, as chief of the staff. Once an honorable soldier, Moran turns into crime. Equally important is the analogy regarding Moran capture. Sherlock Holmes describes Moran as a shikari, which means a big game hunter or a professional hunter. Moran is used to be a hunter. However, during his capture, the roles are reversed. Holmes becomes the hunter and Moran the hunted. Holmes establishes balance inside the depths of London wilderness in big game criminals hunting. The relationship between Holmes and Watson has much been discussed by several analysts given its complex correlation. As Edward Said points out, this union of power and knowledge is contemporary with Doyle's invention of Sherlock Holmes, whose faithful scribe, Dr. Watson, is a veteran of the Northwest frontier, also a man whose approach to life includes a healthy respect for and protection of the law allied with superior specialized intellect inclining to science. Watson, a veteran of the Second Afghan War, is Holmes' faithful friend, without whom Holmes feels lost, as described by him in the short story A Scandal in Bohemia. Holmes represents intelligence, knowledge, and power. On the other hand, Watson is considered inferior on an intellectual level compared to Holmes. However, it is Watson the returnee who writes and reports the adventure and victories of Holmes in a kind of reverse colonialism. Just as in the West and East dichotomy, in which the West is regarded as wise and East as ignorant, so in the relationship between Holmes and Watson we find this antagonism. The character Watson follows Holmes and tries to be similar to the detective, never reaching his abilities. This need to be identical, this mimicry, as Homi Bhabha calls, and I quote, the desire for a reform recognizable other as a subject of a difference that is almost the same but not quite, end of quote, is compelling in Watson. Holmes is always seen by Watson as superior. Watson describes Holmes' adventures not only for future memory but to delight Holmes, and despite several attempts, Holmes' reaction to the tales he reads is always negative criticism. It appears that from a post-colonial perspective, the relationship between Holmes and Watson can be seen as a relationship of submission and admiration. Holmes even tries throughout the canon to teach Watson his scientific methods. At the same time, Holmes belittles Watson, stressing not only his inability to put deductive logic into practice, but constantly criticizing his writing. This ambivalence through mimicry represents the relationship between colonizer and colonized, an emulation that ensures distance, as recalls by Watson. And I quote, I was nearer him than anyone else, and yet I was always conscious of the gap between. Holmes is a prototype of the gentleman, a warrior, a sovereign, always in demand fighting evil, and Watson is knight, his faithful squire who accompanies him on his adventures. In a more contemporary dichotomy associated with the fantastic universe, Holmes could be included in the pantheon of superheroes and Watson is assistant. To conclude, when reviewing the Sherlock Holmes canon, it is evident that it mirrors the duality and mentality of the society and the era in question, the fears and anxieties caused by industrialization and colonial expansion. It can be inferred that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, through the description of the Eastern characters through the dichotomy between Holmes and Watson, and through the reference of addictive substances such as opium, seems to underline British imperialism and the consequences of these Eastern influences. Through the Sherlock Holmes canon is created a division between West and East, one positive and the other negative, exposing an image of the Orient as a reverse image of the British Empire, consequence of its historical context, expansion, and mostly war experiences. Nevertheless, in a post-colonial perspective and analysis, this division is not feasible to be realized. The two vectors are inseparable and interdependent. Like the duality of human nature, good and evil, without the other, the East, the South, the West, does not exist. The otherness is a whole completing human nature with its strengths and flaws regenerating it. And in the end, and I quote, an east wind coming all the same, but it's God's own wind nonetheless, and a cleaner, better, stronger land will lie in the sunshine when the storm has cleared. Thank you.
Maria, thank you very much. And thank you also for your good timekeeping. Thank you very much. The final speaker in this panel is Niyita Sharma. Niyita Sharma has completed her PhD at Oxford in 2019 and is currently Assistant Professor of English at O.P. Jindal Global University in Sonapat in India. She has particular research interests in the unconscious, in representations of race, and in popular genres in 19th century British and South Asian fiction. This afternoon, she's going to talk about stimulating clues and imperial boredom in Sherlock Holmes. So, Niyati, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I hope I can be heard.
Yes.
Just checking the audio. Okay, hi, everyone. Thanks so much to the organizers, first of all, for putting together this wonderful conference, and also to the great lineup of speakers. I've learned so much so far. So to dive into the paper, I'll do my own timekeeping as well. To dive into the paper, I will be speaking about boredom and stimulation in relation to the empire in Conan Doyle's Sign of the Four, primarily. So I'll start reading now. To understand articulations of boredom in the 19th century, critics have often turned to Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary and the protagonist construction of impassioned romances. As the content of the novels of the period reveals, boredom and its alleviation took many different forms, often a turn to an affectively rich imagination or cerebral puzzles. An unusual period, the 19th century witnessed the emergence of a new vocabulary for thinking about boredom as an experience characterized by lack. Patricia Mayer-Spacks describes boredom as a corollary of the rise of individualism, which was accompanied by an increase in entitlement towards the fullness of experience. She describes this as an entitlement which was very different from the previous eras. Boredom, according to philosopher Lars Svensson, is existentially disturbing. It is also, according to him, a state that eludes theorization because often enough it lacks a particular note or texture. Boredom, however, according to him, is not completely ungenerative. In fact, Svensson argues that boredom has led to acts of crime, murders, and even full-scale wars. It is thus not surprising that boredom plays a significant role in the novel of crime and detection. Boredom thus seems to carry with it a weight, but it is a formless and yet dynamic weight that impels the narrative. And the Conan Doyle novel most punctuated by this state is The Sign of the Four. While boredom has been explored in the context of Victorian fiction in relation to the category of gender, the relationship between imperialism, boredom, and its impact on narrative form is yet to be fully explored, and this is what this paper attempts to do. In the story, The Adventure of the Speckled Band, Mr. Roylott is a doctor who practices in Calcutta and then returns to England. He, if we were to go by Yumna Siddiqui's reading, belongs to a class of individuals who would be described as the degenerate aristocrats who have now returned from the colonies. Roylott's stay, according to his stepdaughters, appears to have morally altered him. And this is articulated in the way his capacity to seek stimulation from sources seems to have changed. Roylott, as we are told in the story, appears to befriend a different class of people, the gypsies, to socialize with. He also is very, very excessively and perversely interested in different species of animals like the cheetah and the baboon, and also brings them home. He is in many ways the inversion of the taxonomizer. He too is interested in amassing different species of animals, but after his visit to the colony, this interest is presented as somewhat excessive and almost criminal. The stimulation he seeks through the animals appears to turn poisonous in the end. It is no coincidence that his pet snake's hiss is registered as oral stimuli to begin with by his stepdaughter. And it is this very source of stimuli that kills him in the end. In a way, while Roylott's narrative is a story of moral degeneration, it is one that is reflected in the way he uniquely seeks entertainment after his stay in the colony. So it's very much a story about boredom and how to alleviate that boredom. The Sign of the Four portrays a vision of the empire that appears to bring home a changed mental constitution. In this case, a representative of the empire, Jonathan Small, appears to turn on the empire itself. The novel begins with a mention of drugs, which was also mentioned in the previous presentation, a scene not unusual for a book primarily about crime in connection to India post the 1857 revolt. This association between the empire and addictive substances, a connection that would be accessible to audiences of the period, has previously been noted by Christopher Keefe and Don Randall. In their words, and I quote, "The story of the empire told to itself constituted the active agents of a kind of addiction. the transient satisfactions by which the imperial imaginary sought to confirm its mastery over the troubling problem of alterity, quotes end. At the very outset, the audience's appetite about a novel centered on crime connected to the empire is it's whetted through a displaced association with seemingly orientalized drugs. Holmes, we are told, and I quote, abhors the dull routine and hence needs stimulants to escape the state of mind, an offer that appears to be turned down curiously by Watson because, in his words, he is yet to get over the Afghan camping. Watson represents the nervously altered figure after a stay in the colony, the one struggling with shell shock and someone who's acutely sensitive to the violence of excess stimuli. Holmes, on the other hand, seeks that very violent stimuli. The intense boredom he appears to experience is emphasized throughout the scene. The first chapter ends with Holmes peering out of the window and looking at the urban geography of London, and I quote here, he says, "Was ever such a dreary, dismal, unprofitable world? See how the yellow fog swirls down the streets and drifts across the dun-colored houses. What could be more hopelessly prosaic and material?" Holmes's boredom is displaced onto the setting of London that surrounds him, a setting that the novel repeatedly refers to, especially before shifting the scene to reminders of the colony. Holmes's grouse with the city is an unusual one. He finds the crime too commonplace, too prosaic, and not worthy of analysis. In other words, his need is for an exceptional scene of crime, a break from the routine. The term he uses to describe London is also unusual, unprofitable. In other words, it is a world that does not yield more. This again reveals the changed relationship between the individual and the world, where the attitude to one's surroundings has become extractive in terms of seeking pleasure. That is, Holmes treats the world as that which ought to yield more. And again, looping back to the idea of entitlement from one's context. It is no coincidence that Thaddeus Sholto's house too is found amongst a sea of dull London houses. And I quote, there was something strangely incongruous in this oriental figure framed in the commonplace doorway of a third-rate suburban dwelling house. Similarly, we appear to receive a description of rundown houses in London before we meet Tonga, the Andamanese man from India. What is curious about the novel is that it keeps trying to revive the excitement of the empire amidst London. However, rarely does this attempt live up to expectations. The specter of the empire in the novel becomes a scene which provides stimulation, but one that is never satisfying enough. Jeffrey Auerbach, in his illuminating book, Imperial Boredom, a book that I have used to frame my argument, claims that the experience of the empire by the end of the 19th century was characterized by increasing disillusionment and boredom. And I quote, as it turns out, British men and women in the 19th century found it remarkably difficult to enjoy their imperial present and instead lamented their unmet hopes and dreams and their uncertainty about when, if ever, they were going to go home. Auerbach is concerned not so much with individuals in the imperial metropole, but more with unpacking the experience as it played out for official soldiers stationed in the colonies. Auerbach claims that often officials in the colonies subscribed to the trend of keeping a diary. However, that diary often did not register any events for days. In his analysis of Lieutenant Colonel Norris's diary, who was stationed at Fort Peddie, Auerbach writes, and I quote, it is characterized by brevity and matter-of-factness, and he gives us a catalogue of what is getting registered in those diaries, and he shows us that for days at end, nothing seems to get registered. The same drill, the same routine is being carried out. These accounts then reveal a different picture of the empire, very much like Jonathan Small's vision of disillusionment. By the end of the century, in any case, the popular attitude towards the empire was shifting. Unlike the optimism associated with the empire in the early 19th century, the later Victorian period is characterized by a greater pessimism about its role and its costs, both financial and psychological. And here I want to cue in the previous generation of writers and the writings that was being done on the empire, especially the adventurous, boyish tales that were being written by Frederick Marryat and G.A. Henty. And I wish to contrast that with the vision of the empire, the scene of the empire that we find in The Sign of the Four. It continues to be a vision of the empire that's rooted in a form of masculinity, for sure, but one can contest to what degree is it as optimistic as the one that's promised by at least Frederick Marryat's novels. Perhaps the shifting attitudes to the empire by the end of the century also highlight the varying expectations from the empire and its role in the imagination in terms of stimuli. If the 19th century was the period when living a life free of boredom became one of the central criterion for a happy life, then the lure of the empire at such a moment is also understandable. However, Conan Doyle's novel also raises an important question. What happens when the empire ceases to offer that kind of expected thrill? What happens when the empire is punctuated by boredom? And how does that also then shape or alter the format of the detective novel at work? The link between the colony and the nervous states is regularly established in the novel, or at least it's gestured at in the novel quite constantly. Prior to introducing readers to Tonga, the Andamanese accomplice of Jonathan Small, Holmes begins to discuss his own nervous state. It is almost as if his nervous state allows him to launch into an examination of Tonga's origins. And here I quote, the quote begins, "No, I'm not tired. I have a curious constitution. I never remember feeling tired by work. Though idleness exhausts me completely, I am going to smoke and to think over this queer business to which my fair client introduced us. If ever man had an easy task, this of ours ought to be. Wooden-legged men are not so common, but the other man must, I should think, be absolutely unique." And I'm going to return to this quote in just a bit after introducing what's happening here. As other critics have noted, the fact that Holmes feels more exhausted by boredom than physical labor is revelatory of the changing rhythms of attention in this period. Clearly, Holmes here represents a version of the nervous exhaustion, much discussed in the period, that has somewhat become sublimated into cerebral actions, into cerebrality. Conan Doyle appears to address the problem of sensation overload, excessive stimulation, and nervous exhaustion through an unusual solution, a somewhat neat Cartesian mind-body split that turns intellectual stimulation into a much desired activity. In other words, for Holmes, thinking becomes a way out of ennui and sensational excess. In many ways, his is a nervous exhaustion that turns debilitating, and this is something that Watson appears to warn him about repeatedly throughout the novel. But its very debilitating quality, a state that was repeatedly portrayed in the sensation novels of the period, is cured through intellectual stimuli. Holmes then is not the rational man. He is the nervously exhausted man who derives pleasure from being spent, both in terms of sensations, both in terms of reflexes, and the intellect. In a way, it is boredom and lethargy that impel him to do more. Here, Auerbach's assertion that the empire too was primarily about boredom seems relevant. It is then possibly a disappointment with both the imperial metropole, London, and the colony that push Holmes to desperately seek a cerebral problem to solve. At the moment of nervous exhaustion, going back to the quote I just read out, where he talks about how not tired he feels, at the moment of nervous exhaustion, Holmes's gaze towards Tonga turns sharply classificatory as he labels him unique. Tonga's dehumanization lies in how exciting Holmes finds him, a distraction from the boredom that awaits him. Tonga is introduced as a part of an inventory, one of the many wonders documented in the Imperial Gazetteer. This moment of remarkable racism, masked in a scientific classificatory language, provides Holmes with the much needed stimuli in the moment. Tonga's body is described in distorted terms as a contorted body, and I quote here, "It's naturally hideous, having large misshapen heads." Every aspect of the Andamanese body is distorted to make it even more complicated, like a tortuous puzzle. Of course, the contradiction also lies in the fact that Tonga's body is described in these infantile, distorted terms, but the Andamanese are also shown to be capable of great friendship and companionship and devotion, which somewhat deepens the mystery and the puzzle. Just when Holmes is in need of stimulation, the empire provides him with a specimen that appeals to him viscerally here, but the fascination is presented as an intellectual one. Possibly, Holmes's attitude of finding wonder in the empire via Tonga is an attempt to revive waning interest in the empire, or maybe a sign of the growing disillusionment weariness with the empire. Not everyone is as enthusiastic about Holmes's discovery. Watson, possibly due to his experience in the Afghan War, is not as receptive to Holmes's commentary on Tonga. As is apparent in what follows in the passage, Watson, on hearing about Tonga, on hearing about the Andamanese tribe, soon gives in to his exhaustion and falls asleep. So Watson is not the excited audience here. I now want to move on to the last section of my paper, where I turn to the category of the men who return from the colony, having experienced the ennui firsthand, in this case, Jonathan Small, something Sherlock Holmes only registers from a distance. The novel does uniquely offer an imperial Gothic plot, but the return of the vengeful native is also paired with the return of the disgruntled colonial official. In fact, the central focus of the return is the British man's need to seek revenge. Geoffrey Auerbach has examined the experience of the colonial officers stationed in the colonies, like I said, an experience increasingly characterized by boredom and a sense of waiting, as the instances of fighting and the instances of conflict by the end of the 19th century became shorter temporally. Jonathan Small's experience of the empire is dotted with several events. Lots of things happen in his narrative. Yet his experience does not reveal the adventurous side of living in the colony. Rather, it is characterized by disappointments, losses, and a stay in the prison. While we get a very compressed picture of his life in the colony in his narrative, his experiences primarily are about waiting, weariness, and disruptions. The most defining moment, of course, proves to be the revolt of 1857. Small describes it as an atmosphere lacking safety, where the trained troops turned upon the empire, and in his words, I quote, "The whole country was up like a swarm of bees, and the cruelest part of it was that these men that we fought against, foot, horse, and gunners, were our own picked troops," quote's end. The revolt and its impact on consciousness in Britain can be thought of as a nervous jolt. As Christopher Herbert has argued, the revolt appeared and reappeared across the popular imagination, proving the impact it left on the colonizers' consciousness. Jonathan Small appears to describe India as a collapsed colony. His description of life in the prisons and the corrupt behavior of the colonial officials as they engage in gambling or stealing the treasure demonstrates the same. But most importantly, Small, in his moments of waiting for an escape, develops a connection with the natives, very much like Grimsby Roylott. It is this gravitation towards the racial other that he constantly rationalizes and justifies in his retelling. But it is also apparent that at some level he cherishes these connections. Rather than encountering a story of clear-cut domination of the colonizer over colonized, which would be the core of a story of adventure, we find in Small's story a narrative of complex connections, of unusual alliances. In a way, his is a story of how passing time in the colony, the weariness of that very act, leads to the unlikeliest of relations. And my apologies for the fireworks going on in the background in India. It is while struggling to pass time in the colony that he finds Tonga and his devoted company invigorating and far more reliable than the British officers. The companionship that is revealed as a mark of degeneration is also a symbol of disillusionment with the dream of imperialism and its neat power hierarchies. In a way, the companionship also inversely mirrors the relationship between Holmes and Watson, two friends, with one being very devoted, united in their fight against boredom. Friendship thus becomes a way out of the ennui, but one which is also scarred by the disillusionment of the empire in the case of Jonathan Small. And of course, it's debatable to what degree we can call exploitation friendship as well. The Sign of the Four is then a story of a stay in the imperial colony that resembles the popular imagination of what the adventurous stay in the colony would look like, but it also flips the narrative. The empire then emerges as a specter of a disillusioned reality in Doyle's novels. And of course, it would be interesting to contextualize this within Conan Doyle's own opinions about the empire, which appear to be shifting, primarily optimistic, but also a degree of pessimism. So perhaps the conflicted stimuli that the empire represents it also gives us insight into his perception of his mildly ambivalent perception of the empire. The empire then emerges as a specter of disillusioned reality, so much so that by the end of the novel, Holmes is positively bored after hearing Small's account. Of course, part of the return of boredom has to do with the mystery having been solved. But perhaps this yields another interpretation, that for Holmes too, tales from the empire have become tiresome and very much resemble the depressing London hare he wishes to escape. If they provide stimulus, it is temporary and marked less by novelty and more by other pressing questions. There is, however, always another substitute available, that of cocaine, as Holmes, by the end of the novel, reaches out for it. The cycle of boredom and temporary relief continue as Holmes moves on to the next adventure without having fully addressed the ambivalence about the empire. So, yeah, thank you. That's about it from my end.
Niyati, thank you very much. Thank you for excellent timekeeping and also for fireworks. We have some
My
time now.
pleasure.
We have some time now for questions. If you could, I'm not necessarily going to be able to see hands, so if you could use the chat function. I was going to begin with a question for Mark, and I was wondering about that concern with the Saxon invader, and to what extent that could be read in terms of going back to the Great Game and anxieties about Russia and Russian encroachment in Afghanistan.
Oh, certainly, absolutely, and I think Conan Doyle does. His narratives are littered with the concern around that. I mean, I recently did a piece on the naval treaty where I think he's actually drawing on a specific case of the Russo-Turkish War in 1878, and he was in London at the time when that was reaching the peak, so he was very familiar with that instance. I think for me, when I read the Tales of Long Ago, but also some of those later narratives, I think those external threats to empire are far less significant for him than internal. I think he's worried about a weakening moral and national character, and that actually it ties in quite nicely with that last speaker actually about how the effects of empire will. If empire has the effect on the personality of the nation as a whole, and that to me is, I think, what is really going on. The external threats and the Great Game are probably less relevant to him at this time than the internal threats that he perceives. That sort of devolution of the national character, I think.
Right. Thank you for that. Alice, you have a question.
Yeah, I have a question also for Mark that actually follows on very much from that last point. I was thinking a lot when you were speaking about Harry Wood and Michael Hughes's account of invasion fiction, and they look at it, obviously it's a lot about external threats, that's what it's ostensibly about, but they look at just how much it's also about internal threats, socialism, radicalism, degeneration, all of these kinds of things. So I was wondering when you were speaking, and I did miss the first couple of minutes of your paper, and maybe you said this already, because I've spent a lot of time looking at external threats in Doyle's early work, in the Gothic stories and in the early Holmes tales. And as you were speaking, and also as Maria was speaking, I was thinking, oh my God, I really should have looked at just how much those threats are also about the English characters too. If you look at Lot 249, yes, it's an Egyptian mummy, but it's wielded by an Englishman, and so on. So do you think there's a shift in his work at any time of focus, shifting from external to internal, or maybe it's always there?
I think it's always there. And a good example is going back to the previous paper about the characters who return from the colonies, as Conan Doyle would have put it, in that I think a lot of those characters are already pretty reprehensible before they go out. I can't believe that Roylott or Major Barclay or any of those characters were in any way upstanding members of society before they went to India. So I think there's like in all of Conan Doyle's fiction, and indeed as we covered in several of the papers yesterday, he's not a straightforward character. He will put forward quite conflicting interpretations. And I think the reason for that is primarily that he is, going back to the theme of this conference, a great storyteller. And in a way, he doesn't want to let an interpretation or his own personal view get in the way of telling a great story, which is why I think in a way The Lost World works as a story, and it will still stand the test of time as an adventure novel, even though it's incredibly conflicted opinion about empire, because at the end of that story, he subverts all of the anxieties, just become about the adventure and the romance, and that's what gets you through to the end of that story. So I think he's a conflicted character. Nothing's ever entirely straightforward. I don't think there's a huge shift at any sort of really clear point from external to internal. I think it's always been there, but the balance probably shifts towards the end of that period of the first decade.
Thank you.
In support of what you were saying about what kind of people went out to India, I was reminded of a late 19th century biography of Clive of India, which talked about the problems he constituted as a young man in England, where he was basically running protection rackets and bullying. So he was shipped out to India, and obviously that's then monetized in a different way on a different scale in India.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Douglas, did you have a question, or were you inviting questions?
I do have a question. This
Okay.
you remember the meeting in the Lost World where Challenger keeps standing up saying, "Question." I've got a question. I'm sorry, it's also for Mark, but I want to preface it by saying what a fantastic panel that was. It was really interesting right across the board. Maria was a very full and fascinating treatment of the topic. Also, the best PowerPoint that I've seen for quite a long time. Maria, I hope you'll come back to some future conference and start to dismantle some of the binarisms that you so eloquently posited in that paper. I think all of them are actually unstable if you start to dig away and deconstruct them. And that's one of the things that makes Conan Doyle stories so interesting. Nyati, I thought that was a really provoking, a beautiful paper. I started about halfway through your paper to think about the figure of John Buchan, another imperial writer, and how very frequently Buchan's first chapters begin with the returned imperialist experiencing boredom and wondering what to do and finding ways to counter it. However, to go back to Mark, my question to you, Mark, thanks a lot for your paper, it was great. Simple question. You mentioned Tales of the Grandfather and Puckapook's Hill as precursors to Tales of Long Ago. I just wondered whether you think this is a book for children. And a rather disturbing question which has occupied me recently, is Conan Doyle an author for children?
Children, yeah. I think, so this is interesting. It's particularly a case around his historical fiction, isn't it, really? I mean, you know, the argument is that The White Company and Sir Nigel are adventure novels, and they're tilted much more towards an audience for children.
Also,
I don't think
they're teaching texts, aren't they?
They are. I think that's
the past.
I think that's the key thing, and I think that's partly the hook to why Conan Doyle. That's another hook to why Conan Doyle rates Tales of Long Ago, is because they're instructional texts to some extent, and that's, you know, that runs through all of his writing. In that you look at what he judges as being valuable is a text that is instructional, and what is not valuable, Sherlock Holmes stories, are pure entertainments. And the weird one in that is the Gerard stories, which sort of fall in between, but he sort of gets away with them because he's so enthusiastic about the topic. So I don't think he writes these as being. I don't think he writes them for a children's audience. What he does do is he's quite conscious, certainly in two of the stories, about them being parables. And I think The Last Galley in particular, you can see a sort of sequence of these stories with The Last Galley and Bruce Partington Plans, and then ultimately Danger in 1914, where he's getting increasingly frustrated about the fact that people are not taking seriously the threat to naval supremacy. And he starts with something quite, you know, removed, and then he ends up with something which is equivalent to a punch in the face. And yeah, I think but you're right. I think the historical fiction in particular, it maybe is just the style and what he grew up with, that he is harking back to those early stories that entertained him as a child, and that's what he's reflecting in his work.
It's interesting, isn't it, that a similar question might be put to the historical fiction of Stevenson.
Yeah.
Who's a terrific model for Conan Doyle. And these are great rip-roaring adventure stories. In a way, Kidnapped is a story for boys, The Black Arrow, and so on. I don't really know enough about the status of literature for children or literature for boys in the late 19th century to be sure where this comes in. Maybe other people can think about that.
There's that strange thing about how how we think in terms of genre, and that was in your paper yesterday, of course. But I remember Les Klinger talking about genre not being, not really being a thing until later in the 20th century, and that writers will spill over those boundaries. And I mentioned right at the beginning in passing the Captain Sharky tales, the pirate tales, which I think are written for children, but are absolutely horrendous in terms of violent detail and brutality. And in fact, when he was writing those, he cites one of his favorite novels, which is as a child, which was a really bloodthirsty pirate story with all manner of, tortures. So there's a sort of the same sort of thing that brings that brought the teenage me to watching Hammer House of Horror when I was about 12. There's that kind of brilliant interest in the darker side of things that I think he keeps playing on, doesn't he?
Yeah. Thank you, Mark.
Well, The Lost World is dedicated to boys who are half men and men who are half boys, which is also echoing what Rider Haggard says in the dedication of King Solomon's Mines. I was going to comment on Maria's paper, and following on from Douglas's point about the binaries and destabilizing the binaries, I was just going to throw in the example of laudanum and the way in which opium is being used in England. As it's a mixture of opium and alcohol, which is used very widely in England from the 18th century, and Coleridge notoriously was addicted to that, as were others. So that what's quite interesting is different versions of opium in the English imagination, one of which is that daily use of laudanum and opium being used in the way we might use aspirins, as against this kind of imaginary that you get in that example you quoted from Holmes, which has kind of echoes in Oscar Wilde of the East End opium den and that kind of myth about Chinese opium takers in the East End of London. I wonder if you had thoughts about that, and particularly about how laudanum fits into your account.
That's a very good point. Yes, it's true. I think the opium and cocaine in London in that time, according to these post-colonial theories, it was like the East was taking over London and the nation. However, it was common at the time to take those substances. So what I find amazing, it's it's Watson advice towards the consequences of the use, and I do think that it's not Watson, it's Conan Doyle's experience as a doctor advising not to take those substances on a long term.
Yeah, because there's also his sister as well, who's taking something which is also a mix of, I think, morphine and things.
Queen Victoria took also, so it was normal at the time, and yes, it was very common. But what I find really interesting is Conan Doyle, not Watson advice, but Conan Doyle advice to the regular use of those substances.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Thank you. I had a comment also for Niyati rather than a question, and it's to do with boredom and the boredom of colonial officers, either soldiers or colonial officers. And I'm thinking partly there of a diary that I read belonging to Conrad's friend Sir Hugh Clifford. And Sir Hugh Clifford was in the Malay civil service. There are two of his diaries in existence, both in Kuala Lumpur. And in one of them, when he's very young, he's gone upstate. The diary mainly is to do with playing billiards, or billiard scores. That he's playing billiards with Tunku Alang, and every day it's about those billiards. Almost every day it's about those billiard scores. The more exciting things happen towards the end, but to begin with, there's a lot of playing billiards. And there's a later diary, which is when he's compiling his diary, not his diary, he's compiling a dictionary. And that diary is partly the daily entries are extremely boring because it's cricket, it's his scores at tennis. So it's 6-4, 4-3, whatever, 4-6, whatever, with a kind of less detailed commentary on how far he's getting with the dictionary of Malay words. And again, that runs all the way through the diary until the very end, when he says it was another bad year, the old trouble surfaced again. He doesn't say what the old trouble was. But that idea of the boredom, I thought was really interesting.
Thank you for that. I'll definitely follow up on that. And yeah, this sounds fascinating, even though it sounds quite boring in its registering of documenting of details. But yeah, thank you for that. That's very interesting.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I'm looking in the chat line.
There's a question from Simon James, Robert.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Simon, over to you.
Thanks. Hello. Yes. I mean, I mentioned yesterday how when you teach texts, they sometimes take on a colour from other texts that you set in the same course. And in one of my courses, I teach The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes a couple of weeks after The Picture of Dorian Gray, and my internet cut in and out a bit. So I'm sorry if you mentioned this and I didn't pick it up. But I always wonder if the Holmes takes on some of the aspects of a decadent, at least when you put him in that context. The way in which Lord Henry and Dorian, after his transformation, are always bored. And Holmes too, he has these decadent flourishes where he wants to go and see Patti sing, or he brings up these dusty bottles in the Red-Headed League. I just wondered if you thought there was a place for decadent boredom within your account of Conan Doyle's the ennui.
Thank you for that. That's so fascinating. And I was actually thinking about this just before the presentation, because I was thinking about the description of Thaddeus Sholto's house, which to me definitely seems to echo a lot of those decadent tropes that we're familiar with. However, I would say that one of the things that struck me about the narrative is that we are constantly told how absurd it is to have a house like that in the midst of London. And also, I think that the narrative does gloss over the description of that house. So we get the description, but we don't really get into the minute details of the description. I felt that at least Conan Doyle sort of skips over some aspects of the house. I did feel like in the film, actually, it gets more graphically depicted than it does in the narrative. So that would definitely be something to think about as well. I haven't fully thought through Holmes himself being a decadent figure, because for sure there are echoes of that. But as always, I think the emphasis on the intellectual or the cerebral, and I don't mean it in a simplistic intellectual cerebral sense, also seems to complicate the emphasis on the senses. It almost seems as if the decadent giving in or surrendering to the senses has to also lead to some form of end, or some form of intellectual end, or some form of cerebral end, or the sensorial exhaustion, the nervous exhaustion, almost becomes a rite of passage or a means to something else, to achieving something else. So I think what the decadence would perhaps, in my reading, emphasize is the pointlessness of it, whereas I am not sure if that pointlessness is ever that present in Holmes's narrative. The boredom always has to be anxiously controlled as well and resolved, even as it is a very crucial part of the narrative. So yeah, I haven't fully thought this through, but thank you for that. That's a really,
yes,
really
agreed. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Think about it. Thank you. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions for the speakers?
I have a question about the pronunciation of laudanum. Or laudanum.
Laudanum.
No, I don't know how to pronounce it now.
I'm sure it's laudanum. It's me. I'm being distracted by the Latin, I think, or by Latin.
Sounds rather liturgical, laudanum.
Yes. I'm sure you're right, it's laudanum. Sorry, thank you for the correction. What was it that Doyle's sister was taking? Because I remember reading that she was on presumably something which had been prescribed but had clearly become an addiction. Do you know offhand? Oh,
I'm not aware of Doyle's. Sorry, put that on. I'm not aware of Doyle's sister.
have I got the wrong woman?
You know, I think the common association with addiction with Conan Doyle is his father. And
there is another family member who's female, who's on some. I remember looking up exactly what it is she was taking in the Andrew Lissett's biography, and it was some mixture of I think cannabis, morphine, and something else that she was addicted to. It's given a medical name in the book, or given a long chemical name. But she was on something pretty serious by the sound of things.
Interesting.
So if there are no more questions, what I'd like to do then is thank the three speakers for three really very stimulating and interesting questions, interesting papers, and I'll hand over to Douglas, who'll tell us what happens next.
Thanks, Robert. There are a few more comments coming through in the chat, not so much questions, but additions to what's going on. Thanks, Robert, and thanks to the three speakers, a terrific panel. We now have a break of about 15 minutes. We start again with the next panel at 2:40 GMT. About 15 minutes. See you soon.
Thanks.